She was born in silence, and the pack decided she was born cursed. The winter wind cut through the ravine where they'd left her 3 winters ago, her small frame wrapped in nothing but a torn linen dress and the kind of shame that doesn't warm you. Vera's hands had never spoken, not with words, but they had always listened, to wounds, to fever, to the dying pull of breath leaving a body. The healers in the pack mocked her muteness as incompetence. When her remedies worked, they credited the goddess. When they failed, they whispered her name like a prayer to ruin. So they banished her to the ravine of echoes, where the rejected were meant to fade into stone and snow. She didn't fade. 3 years of solitude had carved her into something sharper than survival. Her small cabin, built from fallen branches and desperation, sat nested between 2 granite walls, hidden from the main valley where packs still thrived on hierarchy and voice. Vera had learned to speak through touch instead. Her fingers could read the heat beneath skin, sense the corruption in blood, find the exact point where life was abandoning a body. But in a world where power demanded you roar, silence was treason. The morning the Alpha King came, the snow fell in sheets thick as burial cloth. Vera was gathering winterroot from the frozen stream when she heard it, not the sound of footsteps, but the absence of them, a heaviness in the air, a wrongness. She turned to see him collapsed at the ravine's edge, his massive frame draped in furs, stained dark with blood, his breathing shallow as a prayer no one answers. Even dying, he was magnificent. His silver-streaked hair fell across a face carved from consequence and steel. A scar split his left eye closed. His left arm hung useless at his side, the wound so deep and infected that even from 10 feet away, Vera could smell the rot creeping through his veins. She should have run. The pack had banished her for a reason. The Alpha King would be no different. He would see her silence as weakness, her small stature as irrelevance. Whatever he was fleeing, whatever enemy had done this to him, he would only bring that violence back to her threshold. But her hands were already moving. Vera crossed the frozen ground without sound, kneeling beside him. His eyes, one silver, one sealed beneath scar tissue, flickered open. She saw the moment he recognized what she was. His lips curved, not into a smile, but into something that looked like surrender. "The silent girl," he rasped, his voice like metal dragged across stone. "They said you were nothing." Vera said nothing. She simply placed her palm against his infected shoulder, and her hands began to listen. What she felt made her freeze. This wasn't ordinary infection. This was curse work, dark, deliberate magic woven into the wound itself. Someone hadn't just tried to kill him. They'd tried to make his death linger, turning his own body into the weapon of his destruction. The infection would spread. In days, maybe hours, it would reach his heart. She looked up at him, searching his face for permission that his voice couldn't give her. "Can you?" he asked, and in those 2 words, Vera heard a man who had never asked for mercy before. She nodded, but as she pressed her other hand to his forehead, feeling the fever that burned like a funeral pyre inside his skull, Vera realized something that terrified her more than any pack ever could. Her gift, the one that had made them call her cursed, was the only thing that might save him. And if she did, if she pulled him back from death's threshold, the Alpha King would owe her a debt that neither of them could afford. The snow fell harder. The wind carried the distant sound of wolves hunting in the valley below. And Vera, the mute girl they'd thrown to the wolves, knelt over the most powerful man in the realm and began the work of resurrection. She worked through the night without stopping. Vera's cabin was small, only 2 rooms carved from rock and insulation. She dragged him inside using every ounce of strength, his massive body weight a mountain she had to move stone by stone. His fever burned so hot that when she pressed a cloth to his skin, steam rose like he was being consumed from within. The curse was alive inside him, a writhing thing that fought every remedy she offered. By dawn, her hands bled. not from carelessness, from the curse itself. Each time she pressed her palms against his wound to drain the corruption, the dark magic lashed back, cutting her skin like invisible glass. But Vera knew something the pack's official healers didn't. The scar tissue building on her hands wasn't weakness, it was proof of work, of sacrifice made tangible. She used moonflower root to cleanse the wound, crushed silverbell leaves to break the fever, but those were only instruments. Her real gift was something older, something the old texts hinted at but never named directly. She could feel sickness the way other people felt heat, could sense where death was winning and where life still clung. And through her touch, through the deliberate transfer of her own vital force, she could push back. It exhausted her in ways that had no name. By the second dawn, the Alpha King's fever broke. His body convulsed, racked by the sudden absence of the heat that had consumed him. Vera held him steady, one hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat return to something resembling rhythm. His eyes opened, both of them this time. The scar had loosened enough to let him see through the sealed eye. What she found in that gaze made her breath catch, recognition, and something deeper, something like shame. "You should have let me die," he said. His voice was stronger now, but rough with the texture of a man pulled back from a place he'd accepted as his only destination. Vera shook her head, and in the gesture she placed the whole of her refusal to his judgment. "What's your name?" he asked. She pointed to herself, then made a small gesture, a hand opening like a flower. "Vera." He tested the word like it might break. "That means spring, new growth." She nodded slowly. "I am Kyle," he continued, and she heard the weight of introduction, of hierarchy being offered and then deliberately lowered. "I am called the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and 3 days ago I was betrayed by my own blood." Vera listened without speaking, as she always did, but this time her listening was different. She wasn't just hearing words. She was feeling the truth beneath them, the remorse, the fury held carefully in check, the wound that had nothing to do with the curse in his shoulder. Kale struggled to sit up, and Vera helped him, arranging furs behind him. His left arm still hung useless, but the infection had retreated. The wound, while still angry and deep, no longer smelled of death. "Your gift," he said quietly. "It's not what they told the pack." Vera made a gesture, a small, dismissive wave. She'd heard the accusations before: witchcraft, devilry, communion with darkness. "No," Kale continued, his single eye fixed on hers with an intensity that made her want to turn away. "It's something else, something rarer. The old texts speak of them. Pathfinders, healers born with the ability to walk the threshold between life and death, to pull others back from the edge." Vera had never heard the word before, but something in her chest recognized it as truth. Kale reached out with his right hand and gently took her left, turning it over to examine the cuts the curse had left behind. They ran in delicate lines across her palm, like roads drawn on a map, like routes only she could navigate. "You're marked," he said, "just as I am." He showed her his own palm, a scar in the shape of a crescent moon, old and white against his darker skin. "Every true alpha carries a wound that shapes his reign," Kyle explained. "Mine is this mark. It came the night I was crowned, burned into my hand by the goddess herself as a reminder that power is a burden, not a gift. But yours." He traced the fresh scars again. "Yours are different. These aren't marks of punishment. They're marks of choosing. Every time you heal, you pay in blood." Vera's eyes burned, but she didn't look away. "And now you've paid for me," Kale said. "A stranger, a king you had no reason to save." Vera reached out her other hand and placed it over his heart. She felt it beating, strong, steady, alive. She looked at him directly and shook her head once, hard. There was no debt. There was only what her hands knew how to do. Kyle's expression shifted, and for the first time since he'd collapsed at her threshold, she saw him as he might have been before the curse, before the betrayal. She saw him as young, as uncertain, as someone who had carried the weight of a crown so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be simply human. "Stay with me," Vera signed, using the old hand language the elders had taught her as a child. "Heal." And Kale, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, nodded. On the fourth day, the visitors came. Vera heard them first, the distant baying of hounds, the organized thunder of hooves climbing the ravine path. She was outside gathering clean snow when she caught the scent, wolf musk and iron, and the particular stench of men who traveled with violence as their only compass. Her hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt, not that it would help against a hunting party, but old fears die slowly. Kyle appeared in the doorway, still moving carefully, but no longer like a man held together by thread alone. He was shirtless, the wound on his shoulder bandaged with the healing poultices Vera had prepared. When he saw the expression on her face, his entire body tensed. "They've found me," he said quietly. Not a question. Vera nodded and grabbed his arm, pulling him back inside. She'd prepared for this possibility. The cabin had a back passage, a narrow gap between the rocks that opened onto a secondary ravine. It wasn't much, but it was hidden. But Kale resisted. "If I run," he said, "they'll tear apart this entire region looking for me. They'll find you. And you'll become what they've already decided you are, a traitor, a collaborator with a fallen king." Vera's grip tightened on his arm, but she already knew he was right. The pack's logic was simple and brutal. Mercy was treason. Shelter was conspiracy. She released him. Kale moved to the single window and looked out at the riders gathering at the ravine's mouth. There were at least a dozen, bearing the mark of the Silver Mountain Pack. Not his pack, but his rivals. House Varek, the family that had grown fat on the edges of his throne while pretending loyalty. "My cousin," Kyle said, and Vera heard the hollow space where emotion had been burned away. "The one who gave me this wound. He's come to finish it." The knock came moments later. Not a knock. Really, a fist against the door so hard the frame shuddered. "Come out, Pathfinder," a voice called, cultured and cold. "Surrender the king, and we'll let you live." Vera felt Kale's hand find hers in the darkness of the cabin's interior. "Don't," he whispered. "No matter what happens, don't let them take you." But before she could respond, Vera felt something shift in her own body. The scars on her palms began to burn, not with pain, but with purpose. Heat radiated from her hands like two small suns. She understood, in that moment, what the old texts had tried to describe. A pathfinder wasn't just a healer. In moments of existential crisis, when the boundary between life and death became thin enough to touch, they became something else entirely. They became guardians of thresholds. Vera stepped toward the door. Kyle tried to hold her back, but she was already moving, already transforming. Her voice, the one she'd never used, the one that had been stolen by silence, rose from her throat in something that wasn't words, but pure crystalline sound. It was the note that sits between music and prayer, between mercy and war. The door exploded outward. Outside, the hunters fell to their knees, their hands over their ears, their horses screaming in primal terror. The sound Vera made wasn't violent. It was worse. It was truth. It was judgment. It was the voice of everything they'd tried to destroy speaking back to them in their own blood. When silence returned, the riders were already fleeing, their dignity shattered like frost beneath boots. Vera stood in the doorway, breathing hard, her voice stolen again by the effort. Behind her, Kale moved forward and placed his palm against her back, the one bearing the crescent moon mark. "Now I understand," he said quietly. "You're not meant to be healed by me. I'm meant to be healed by you, and we're both meant to survive what comes next." The moon rose silver over the ravine, and somewhere in the distance, wolves began to sing their confusion to the stars. Vera's voice didn't return for 2 days. She could feel it trapped somewhere behind her breastbone, a songbird that had flown once and now refused to emerge. Her throat ached with the memory of it, with the weight of sounds she'd never been meant to carry. The effort of channeling that much power through a body that had only ever expressed itself through touch and gesture had cost her something she couldn't quite name. Kyle took care of her this time. He moved through the cabin with the careful grace of a man learning to exist in spaces smaller than kingdoms. He brewed tea from the herbs she pointed to. He changed the poultice on her throat without being asked, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands that had presumably known war. He sat beside her in the darkness and told her stories. "I wasn't always a king," he began on the second night, the fire casting his scarred profile into copper and shadow. "I was the third son. No one expected I'd survive to inherit, but plague took my brothers. And my father—" He paused, and Vera saw him swallow something bitter. "My father believed a weakened heir was better than no heir at all." Vera gestured for him to continue. "So I learned to lead through fear," Kale said, "through displays of strength, through the understood cost of betrayal. I thought that was what kept the realm stable. I thought cruelty was just another word for duty." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. "My cousin Darek watched me build this empire on severity, and he learned well, too well. He realized that if I could rule through fear, perhaps he could too. Perhaps he could be king in my place, and no one would notice the difference." "The wound," Vera signed, her fingers moving in the old language that still lived in her hands. Kale nodded. "He came to me during the Winter Council, asked for a private audience, and when I turned my back—" His voice dropped to something barely audible. "He used a blade blessed with curse work, not to kill me outright, to make me die slowly, to make me suffer in front of the entire court so they'd see me as weak, so they'd choose him as my successor while I was still drawing breath." Vera reached out and took his scarred hand, the one with the crescent moon. "But I ran instead," Kale continued. "And I came to the ravine of echoes, where the rejected end their stories. I thought it was the end. I thought the irony was fitting, a king undone by the very thing he'd built his throne on. Mercilessness." He turned to face her fully. "And then you found me." Vera pointed to herself, then made a questioning gesture. She wanted to know if he understood what she was asking without words. Why me? Why not someone stronger? Someone who could speak? "Because," Kyle said, understanding perfectly, "strength isn't about noise. I finally learned that. Strength is about what you're willing to pay. The scars on your palms prove you understand sacrifice. The way you stood at that door and refused to let violence consume your home, that's real power. The kind that can't be learned from a throne." He held up his hand, showing her the crescent moon again. "This mark was given to remind me that power requires burden. But I think I've been interpreting it wrong my entire reign. I thought the burden was the weight of dominion, but maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the weight of understanding that even kings can be unmade. That mercy isn't weakness. It's the only thing strong enough to transform a man who's been broken." By dawn, Vera's voice had begun to return. It emerged as whispers first, single syllables that sounded like wind through a canyon. But she didn't use it. Instead, she let it grow, slowly, secretly, understanding now that some power was meant to be held in reserve. Some gifts were most potent when kept in silence, and in that silence, something shifted between them. It wasn't love yet. It was something rawer, recognition. Kale saw in Vera the reflection of himself he'd been too proud to acknowledge. And Vera saw in Kale the possibility that even a king could learn humility. The fire burned lower, and neither of them moved to feed it. On the 8th day, a rider came alone. This was unusual enough to be alarming. Vera sensed Kale's tension the moment the horse appeared at the ravine's edge, a young woman in the colors of the Silver Mountain Pack, her face pale with the effort of the climb. She carried a white flag, the ancient symbol of parley. Vera watched from the cabin doorway as Cale walked out to meet her, his left arm now functional enough to rest at his side without support. He moved like a king again, Vera noticed. But it was a different kind of kingship than it had been before. Less armor, more bone. The conversation was brief. Vera couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. The messenger spoke urgently, gesturing back toward the valley. Kyle's responses were measured, controlled. When the young woman finally turned to leave, he called after her, something that made her pause. When he returned to the cabin, his face was carved from something harder than before. "Darek is dying," he said simply. "The curse work he used on me was imperfect. It's beginning to consume him instead. The court is fracturing. They want me to return, claim the throne, and either save him or let him perish publicly as a warning to anyone who might consider treason." Vera felt her hands go cold. Cale continued, pacing now, his movements sharp with agitation. "If I go back, I can stabilize the realm. I can prevent a war that would devastate the northern territories. But I'd have to perform that role they expect, the merciless king. I'd have to make an example of Darek. I'd have to let them believe nothing has changed, that I'm still the man who built a throne on severity and fear." He stopped and looked at her directly. "And if I don't go back, they'll come here. They'll burn the ravine and everyone in it to draw me out. They'll use you as leverage. They'll finish what Darek started." Vera walked to him slowly and placed her hands on his face. The scars on her palms pressed against his skin, and through that contact, she could feel the weight he was carrying. The impossible mathematics of being responsible for an entire realm while also responsible for one small healer in a cabin at the edge of the world. She made a decision. Vera moved to her shelves and began pulling items down. Moonflower root, silverbell leaves, the small vial of liquid starlight that she'd been saving for the direst circumstances, a remedy that could mask the presence of curse work, hide a wound from magical sight. She placed them all in Cale's hands. "What are you doing?" he asked. Vera signed slowly, deliberately. "You go back. You become the king they need. And you hide me. You hide what I am. You hide what we've discovered together. And when the time is right, when the realm is stable again, when they stop looking for a silent girl and a cursed king, then we choose. Not duty, not survival. Choice." Cale's hands trembled as he held the remedies. "You're asking me to leave you," he said. Vera shook her head. She pointed to her heart, then to his. She touched the crescent moon scar on his palm, then traced one of her own scars. "We're marked," she signed. "We're connected now, not by location, by what we've survived together. You go, you do what must be done, and I will wait. I will know, through whatever connection binds healers to those they've pulled back from death. I will know if you're true." Cale pulled her close, and for the first time, Vera felt his lips against her forehead. Not a kiss of passion, but something deeper. A vow, a binding. "I'll return," he whispered. "When this is over, when the realm has healed, I'll return to the ravine of echoes." Vera nodded against his chest, feeling his heartbeat, strong, steady, alive because of her hands. By nightfall, Cale was gone, riding back toward the kingdom with the messenger. Vera stood at the cabin threshold and watched until even the memory of hoofbeats faded. She was alone again. But this time, it didn't feel like banishment. This time, it felt like waiting. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what hour does this story find you? We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they reach your heart. Months passed in the rhythm of seasons. Winter receded, and spring flooded the ravine with green that Vera had almost forgotten existed. The cabin became a sanctuary of routine. Gather, tend, heal the occasional wounded creature that found its way to her door. But there was a difference now. Where before she'd healed out of necessity, out of the simple fact that her hands couldn't refuse their nature, now she healed with intention. With the knowledge that every scar she earned connected her to something larger. Every night at moonrise, she would stand at the ravine's edge and feel for the thread that bound her to Kale. She could sense him, alive, struggling, burdened. There were nights when she felt his exhaustion so keenly that her own body ached with the weight of a kingdom she'd never seen. But he was keeping his vow. He was doing what must be done, and he hadn't forgotten. By late spring, a package arrived, brought by a hooded rider who left it at the ravine's mouth and departed without words. Inside, wrapped in silk the color of twilight, was a metal howl, a crescent moon made of silver, inscribed on the back with words in the old language, "For the one who taught me that strength is silent." Vera wore it always after that, hidden beneath her dress, resting directly over her heart. The summer brought rumors. Traveling healers passed through the ravine, seeking Vera's counsel. Word had spread, carefully and quietly, that there was a mute woman in the ravine of echoes with gifts beyond comprehension. She helped them as she always had, asking nothing in return. But through their conversations, she learned of the changes Kale was making in the kingdom. He'd healed Darek, not out of mercy, but out of something more complex. He'd broken the curse and then offered his cousin a choice, exile or service. Darek had chosen exile, and the entire court had watched a prince of the Silver Mountain Pack walk into the frozen north, stripped of title and power. It was a mercy more devastating than death would have been, and the realm was changing. Kyle had begun to rebuild the hierarchy based not on fear, but on competence, on justice rather than severity, on the understanding that a kingdom built on crushing its own people is a kingdom destined to collapse beneath its own weight. By autumn, a messenger came with official sanction, no longer hooded, but bearing the royal seal. The Alpha King requests the presence of Vera, Pathfinder of the Ravine, at the Winter Court, the woman said formally. He wishes to honor the one who healed him. Vera's hands trembled as she packed her belongings. She understood what this meant. To come to the court was to be exposed, to have her silence transformed into spectacle, to become not a healer but a symbol, a trophy of the king's enlightenment. It would change everything. She would no longer be a secret, a private redemption shared between two souls. She would become public property. But she also understood something else. This was the choice Kale had promised her. Not duty disguised as destiny, but genuine freedom, to accept or refuse, to step into the light or remain in shadow, knowing that either way, he would honor her decision. Vera wrote a single word on a piece of parchment and tied it to the messenger's saddle with a silk ribbon that matched her metal howl. Yes, the rider smiled, understanding that a single word from the silent healer carried more weight than 1,000 declarations. That night, as Vera prepared to leave the ravine for the first time in 3 years, she stood at the threshold of her cabin and looked at the place that had held her when the world tried to destroy her. The snow had already begun to fall, the first snow of the approaching winter, and it fell in gentle sheets. Not the violent wind of exile, but the soft benediction of a season turning toward home. The moon rose full and luminous above the cliffs, and Vera, the healer they'd mocked, the girl they'd thrown to the wolves, stepped out into her destiny, knowing she'd chosen it herself. Like if you believe rejection can become destiny. The Winter Court was a cathedral of ice and stone. Vera had expected grandeur, but not this. The castle rose from the mountainside like something that had grown there rather than been built. Towers of pale granite catching the winter sun and throwing it back in fragments of blinding white. Banners in silver and midnight blue caught the wind with the sound of war drums, and the entire structure seemed to hum with the weight of power, concentrated and crystallized. She arrived in a carriage draped in furs, the messenger having insisted on comfort for the journey. Now, descending the steps into the castle's great hall, Vera understood why. The court needed to see her as something other than a beggar. A pathfinder wasn't the healer of common folk. It was a rarity that hadn't walked among royalty in living memory. Cale stood at the far end of the hall, and when he saw her, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He was transformed, not in a way that suggested change, but in a way that suggested emergence. The man who stood before the assembled nobility was still the Alpha King, still bearing the weight of the realm, but there was something new in him. A serenity that came not from the absence of burden, but from the acceptance of it. From understanding that power's true test wasn't whether you could crush your enemies, but whether you could choose mercy when cruelty would be easier. Vera moved forward, and she felt the eyes of every noble tracking her path through the hall. She could sense their confusion, their hunger for explanation. Who was this silent girl? What alchemy had convinced their king to surrender his pride for the counsel of one so small, so unremarkable? They didn't understand yet. They would need to be taught. "My realm," Kyle addressed the assembled court, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "This is Vera, whom I have brought to you as proof of something I have recently learned. That strength is not the absence of need, but the courage to acknowledge it." He descended from his throne and walked to meet her. When he took her hand, there was an audible gasp from the nobility. "I came to her broken and cursed," Cale continued, "dying from wounds I had created through my own failures. And she healed me, not through magic born of dominion or force, but through sacrifice, through the willingness to pay a cost with her own blood to restore what had been destroyed." He turned to face Vera directly, and in his single eye, the scarred one, the one that had been sealed shut by curse work, she saw tears. "A pathfinder," he said for the benefit of the court, "is not born from privilege or power. She is born when the realm itself needs mercy made manifest, and we have been blessed with her presence." There was silence. Then, slowly, the first noble bowed, then another and another, until the entire court was bending, acknowledging something beyond their hierarchy, beyond their understanding. But Vera felt the weight of it differently than they did. She felt it as responsibility, as the beginning of a burden that would follow her as long as she lived. She would be expected to heal now, to transform her private grace into public service, to become something larger than herself. It was terrifying. Kyle seemed to understand. He squeezed her hand once, gently, and signed to her using the old language that no one else in the court would recognize. "You are free. You always will be." That night, they stood alone in the tower room, where Cale had insisted she be housed, not as a servant, but as an honored guest. The view overlooked the entire kingdom, the mountains dark against a star-filled sky, the frozen lakes reflecting the moon like mirrors of another world. "I had to expose you," Kyle said quietly. "To bring you here was to remove your anonymity. I know that's a cost I asked you to pay, and I can't undo it." Vera placed her finger against his lips. Then she signed, "You're asking me to build a kingdom with you, a different kind of kingdom, one where healers don't hide, where the silent have voice, where power is measured in compassion, not in conquest." "Is that what you want?" Kyle asked. Vera gestured to the metal hoe at her throat, the crescent moon that matched the scar on his palm. She touched his scar, then touched her own marks, the lines scored across her palms by the price of resurrection. "We're marked," she reminded him. "We always were meant for this, not by punishment, by purpose." Cale pulled her close, and this time the kiss was not a vow, but a consummation. A choice made freely by two people who had learned that love wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you built, one day at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one moment of choosing compassion over cruelty. Below them, the kingdom slept under a blanket of fresh snow, and above, the moon continued its ancient journey across the stars. 1 year later, the kingdom had transformed. The changes were subtle at first, then revolutionary. Kyle had dismantled the hierarchy of fear and rebuilt it on the foundation of merit. Healers were no longer scorned. They were honored. Schools were established in every territory where young people with gifts like Vera's could learn their craft without shame. The ravines and exiles, the places where the rejected were meant to fade, were transformed into sanctuaries. And Vera had become what she'd never imagined, not a recluse, but a teacher. She still couldn't speak aloud, though the ability had returned. She'd chosen silence as her permanent state, understanding now that it wasn't a limitation, but a gift. In silence, she heard things that voice-bound people missed. She understood suffering in its purest form. She recognized the language of pain and transformation that existed beneath all words. On the night of the winter solstice, exactly 1 year after Kale had collapsed at the threshold of her cabin, the court gathered for a ceremony that no one had anticipated. Vera stood beside Kale at the altar of the great hall, and around them, every healer and pathfinder that the kingdom had managed to find gathered, a small group, perhaps a dozen, but growing. These were the ones who had lived in hiding, who'd been shamed for their gifts, who'd been told that mercy was weakness. Now they stood in the castle of the Alpha King, wearing robes of silver and midnight blue, the colors of the crown. "A year ago I nearly died," Kyle spoke to the assembled court. "And I was saved not by the strongest of us, but by the quietest. Not by the one who shouted, but by the one who listened. And I learned something that changed everything I thought I knew about power." He took Vera's hand and raised it for all to see, showing the scars that tracked across her palms like roads on a map. "These marks represent the cost of mercy," Kyle said. "They represent the willingness to bleed so that another might live. And I am announcing today that this will be the new symbol of the highest order in my kingdom. Not a crown, not a sword, but a scar. Not the marks of conquest, but the marks of compassion made visible." He turned to Vera, and in full view of the entire court, he dropped to one knee. "I am asking," Kale said, his voice thick with emotion, "for Vera to serve as the keeper of healers, to stand at my side not as a queen, a title that suggests dominion, but as an equal in the work of transformation. To help me remake this realm so that silence is valued, that sacrifice is honored, and that healing becomes the highest calling a person can answer." Vera's hands trembled as she helped Kyle to his feet. Through the gesture, she answered, "Yes, always yes." In silence, and in whatever voice the kingdom needs. They didn't kiss in front of the court. Instead, they pressed their foreheads together, the ancient greeting of equals, of those who understood each other beyond words. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. This wasn't a love story about possession or dominion. It was a story about two broken people who'd chosen to be healed together. Later, after the ceremonies had ended and the court had dispersed, Vera and Kale stood once more on the tower overlooking the kingdom. "Do you regret it?" Kale asked, leaving the ravine, stepping into the light. Vera thought about this carefully. She thought about the silence she'd lost and found again. She thought about the cost of visibility, the weight of being seen as a symbol rather than simply a person. She thought about the responsibility she'd accepted. Then she signed. The ravine was a place to survive. This is a place to live. They're not the same thing. Kale understood perfectly. They stood together as the moon rose, the same moon that had witnessed her exile and her salvation, the same moon that had watched her heal a dying king and allow herself to be healed in return. The snow fell in gentle spirals, and the kingdom beneath them began its work of transformation, slow, patient, relentless as the turning of seasons. Vera reached for Kyle's hand and placed it over her heart where the metal hone rested. He did the same, guiding her hand to the crescent moon scar on his palm. 2 marks of power, 2 languages of loss made visible, 2 people who understood that redemption wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose, again and again, every moment of every day. And in the silence between them, in the space where words would only diminish meaning, they acknowledged what had taken a year to understand completely. They weren't healed despite their wounds. They were healed because of them. And they would spend whatever remained of their lives learning how to transform pain into wisdom, sacrifice into strength, and silence into the voice that speaks louder than any shout. The final snow of winter fell, blanketing the kingdom in white. And beneath that blanket, life, true, patient, miraculous life, continued its ancient work of growing, healing, and becoming whole. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.